Chapter 18 of Tom Swift in the Land of Wonders. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tom Swift in the Land of Wonders by Victor Appleton. Chapter 18 El Tigre. The four men gazed at one another. Consternation showed on the face of Professor Bumper, and was reflected, more or less, on the countenances of his companions. "Are you sure the map is gone?" asked Tom. "I know how easy it is to mislay anything in a camp of this sort. I couldn't at first find my safety razor this morning, and when I did locate it, the hoe was in one of my shoes. I'm sure a rat or some jungle animal must have dragged it there. Now, maybe they took your map, Professor. That oiled silk in which it was wrapped might have appealed to the taste of a rat or a snake." "It is no joking matter," said Professor Bumper. "But I know you appreciate the seriousness of it as much as I do, Tom. But I had the map in the pocket of this coat, and now it is gone." "When did you put it there?" asked Ned. "This morning, just before I came to breakfast." "Oh, then you have had it since last night!" Tom ejaculated. "Yes, I slept with it under my clothes that I rolled up for a pillow, and when it was my turn to stand guard I took it with me. Then I put it back again and went to sleep. When I awoke and dressed I put the packet in my pocket and ate breakfast. Now, when I look for it, why, it's gone!" "The map or the oiled silk package?" asked Mr. Damon, who, once having been a businessman, was sometimes a stickler for small points. "Both," answered the professor. "I opened the silk to tie it more smoothly, so it would not be such a lump in my pocket, and I made sure the map was inside." "Then the whole thing has been taken, or you have lost it," suggested Ned. "I am not in the habit of losing valuable maps," retorted the scientist. "And the pocket of my coat I had made deep for the purpose of carrying the long map. It could not drop out." "Well, we mustn't overlook any possible chances," suggested Tom. "Come on now, we'll search every inch of the ground over which you traveled this morning, Professor." "It must be found," murmured the scientist. "Without it, all our work will go for naught." They all went into the tent where the professor and Mr. Damon had slept when they were not on guard. The camp was a busy place, with the Indians finishing their morning meal, and getting ready for the work of the day. For word had been given out that there would be no more long periods of travel. In consequence, efforts were being directed by the head men of the bearers to make a more permanent camp in the wilderness. Shelters of palm-thatched huts were being built, a site for cooking fires made, and, at the direction of Mr. Damon, to whom this part was entrusted, some sanitary regulations were insisted on. Leaving this busy scene, the four, with solemn faces, proceeded to the tent where it was hoped the map would be found. But, though they went through everything, and traced and retraced every place the professor could remember having traversed about the canvas shelter, no signs of the important document could be found. "I don't believe I dropped it out of my pocket," said the scientist, for perhaps the 20th time. "Then it was taken," declared Tom. "That's what I say," chimed in Ned, "and by some of Beecher's party." "Easy, my boy," cautioned Mr. Damon. "We don't want to make accusations we can't prove." "That is true," agreed Professor Bumper. "But, though I am sorry to say it of a fellow archaeologist, I cannot help thinking Beecher had something to do with the taking of my map." "But how could any of them get it?" asked Mr. Damon. "You say you had the map this morning, and certainly none of them has been in our camp since dawn, though of course it is possible that some of them sneaked in during the night." "It does seem a mystery how it could have been taken in open daylight, while we were about camp together," said Tom. "But is the loss such a grave one, Professor Bumper?" "Very grave. In fact, I may say it is impossible to proceed with the excavating without the map." "Then what are we to do?" asked Ned. "We must get it back," declared Tom. "Yes," agreed the scientist. "We cannot work without it. As soon as I make a little further search to make sure it could not have dropped in some out-of-the-way place, I shall go over to Professor Beecher's camp and demand that he give me back my property." "Suppose he says he hasn't taken it?" asked Tom. "Well, I'm sure he either took it personally or one of his party did. And yet I can't understand how they could have come here without our seeing them," and the professor shook his head in puzzled despair. A more detailed search did not reveal the missing map, and Mr. Damon and his friend, the scientist, were on the point of departing for the camp of their rivals, less than a mile away, when Tom had what really amounted to an inspiration. "Look here, Professor," he cried. "Can you remember any of the details of your map? Say, for instance, where we ought to begin excavating to get at the wonders of the underground city?" Well, Tom, I did intend to compare my map with the configuration of the country about here. There is a certain mountain which serves as a landmark and a guide for a starting point. I think that is it over there," and the scientist pointed to a distant snow-capped peak. The party had left the low and marshy land of the true jungle, and were among the foothills, though all about them was dense forest and underbush, which, in reality, was as much a jungle as the lower plains, but was less wet. "The point where I believe we should start to dig," said the professor, "is near the spot where the top of the mountain casts a shadow when the sun is 1 hour high. At least that is the direction given in the old manuscripts. So, though we can do little without the map, we might make a start by digging there." "No, not there!" exclaimed Tom. "Why not?" "Because we don't want to let Beecher's crowd know that we are on the track of the idol of gold." "But they know anyhow, for they have the map," commented Ned, puzzled by his chum's words. "Maybe not," said Tom slowly. "I think this is a time for a big bluff. It may work and it may not. Beecher's crowd either has the map or they have not. If they have it, they will lose no time in trying to find the right place to start digging, and then they'll begin excavating." "Very good. If they do that, we have a right to dig near the same place. But if they have not the map, which is possible, and if we start to dig where the professor's memory tells him is the right spot, we'll only give them the tip, and they'll dig there also." "I'm sure they have the map," the professor said. "But I believe your plan is a good one, Tom." "Just what do you propose doing?" asked Ned. "Fooling 'em!" exclaimed Tom quickly. "We'll dig in some place remote from the spot where the mountain casts its shadow. They will think, if they haven't the map, that we are proceeding by it, and they'll dig too. When they find nothing, as will also happen to us, they may go away. If, on the other hand, they have the map, and see us digging at a spot not indicated on it, they'll be puzzled, knowing we must have some idea of where the buried city lies. They will think the map is at fault, perhaps, and not make use of it. Then we can get it back." "Bless my hatband!" cried Mr. Damon. "I believe you're right, Tom. We'll dig in the wrong place to fool 'em." And this was done. Search for the precious map was given up for the time being, and the professor and his friends set the natives to work digging shafts in the ground, as though sinking them down to the level of the buried city. But though this false work was prosecuted with vigor for several days, there was a feeling of despair among the Bumper party over the loss of the map. "If we could only get it back!" exclaimed the professor again and again. Meanwhile the Beecher party seemed inactive. True, some members of it did come over to look on from a respectful distance at what the diggers were doing. Some of the rival helpers, under the direction of the head of the expedition, also began sinking shafts, but they were not in the locality remembered by Professor Bumper as being correct. "I can't imagine what they're up to," he said. "If they have my map they would act differently, I should think." "Whatever they're up to," answered Tom, "the time has come when we can dig at the place where we can hope for results." And the following day shafts were started in the shadow of the mountain. Until some evidence should have been obtained by digging, as to the location beneath the surface of a buried city, there was nothing for the travelers to do but wait. Turns were taken in directing the efforts of the diggers, and an occasional inspection was made of the shafts. "What do you expect to find first?" asked Tom of Professor Bumper one day, when the latter was at the top of a shaft waiting for a bucket load of dirt to be hoisted up. "Potsherds and artifacts," was the answer. "What sort of bugs are they?" asked Ned, with a laugh. He and Tom were about to go hunting with their electric rifles. "Artifacts are things made by the Indians, or whatever members of the race who built the ancient cities were called, such as household articles, vases, ornaments, tools, and so on. Anything made by artificial means is called an artifact." "And potsherds are things with those Chinese laundry ticket scratches on them," added Tom. "Exactly," said the professor, laughing. "Though some of the strange appearing inscriptions give much valuable information. As soon as we find some of them, say a broken bit of pottery with hieroglyphics on, I will know I am on the right track." And while the scientist and Mr. Damon kept watch at the top of the shaft, Tom and Ned went out into the jungle to hunt. They had killed some game, and were stalking a fine big deer, which would provide a feast for the natives, when suddenly the silence of the lonely forest was broken by a piercing scream, followed by an agonized cry of "El tigre! El tigre!" End of chapter 18. Of Tom Swift in the Land of Wonders. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tom Swift and the Land of Wonders by Victor Appleton. Chapter 19. Poisoned Arrows. "Did you hear that, Tom?" asked Ned in a hoarse whisper. "Surely," was the cautious answer. "Keep still, and I'll try for a shot." "Better be quick," advised Ned in a tense voice. "The chap who did that yelling seems to be in trouble." And as Ned's voice trailed off into a whisper, again came the cry, this time in frenzied pain. "El tigre! El tigre!" Then there was a jumble of words. "It's over this way!" and this time Ned shouted, seeing no need for low voices since the other was so loud. Tom looked to where Ned had parted the bushes alongside a jungle path. Through the opening the young inventor saw, in a little glade, that which caused him to take a firmer grip on his electric rifle, and also a firmer grip on his nerves. Directly in front of him and Ned, and not more than 100 yards away, was a great tawny and spotted jaguar, the tigre or tiger of Central America. The beast, with lashing tail, stood over an Indian upon whom it seemed to have sprung from some lair, beating the unfortunate man to the ground. Nor had he fallen scatheless, for there was blood on the green leaves about him, and it was not the blood of the spotted beast. "Oh, Tom, can you—" and Ned faltered. The young inventor understood the unspoken question. "I think I can make a shot of it without hitting the man," he answered, never turning his head. "It's a question, though, if the beast won't claw him in the death struggle. It won't last long, however, if the electric bullet goes to the right place, and I've got to take the chance." Cautiously Tom brought his weapon to bear. Quiet as Ned and he had been after the discovery, the jaguar seemed to feel that something was wrong. Intent on his prey, for a time he had stood over it, gloating. Now the brute glanced uneasily from side to side, its tail nervously twitching, and it seemed trying to gain, by a sniffing of the air, some information as to the direction in which danger lay, for Tom and Ned had stooped low, concealing themselves by a screen of leaves. The Indian, after his first frenzied outburst of fear, now lay quiet, as though fearing to move, moaning in pain. Suddenly the jaguar, attracted either by some slight movement on the part of Ned or Tom, or perhaps by having winded them, turned his head quickly and gazed with cruel eyes straight at the spot where the two young men stood behind the bushes. "He's seen us," whispered Ned. "Yes," assented Tom, "and it's a perfect shot. Hope I don't miss." It was not like Tom Swift to miss, nor did he on this occasion. There was a slight report from the electric rifle, a report not unlike the crackle of the wireless, and the powerful projectile sped true to its mark. Straight through the throat and chest under the uplifted jaw of the jaguar it went, through heart and lungs. Then with a great coughing, sighing snarl, the beast reared up, gave a convulsive leap forward toward its newly discovered enemies, and fell dead in a limp heap just beyond the native over which it had been crouching before it delivered the death stroke, now never to fall. "You did it, Tom! You did it!" cried Ned, springing up from where he had been kneeling to give his chum a better chance to shoot. "You did it, and saved the man's life!" And Ned would have rushed out toward the still twitching body. "Just a minute," interposed Tom. "Those beasts sometimes have as many lives as a cat. I'll give it one more for luck." Another electric projectile through the head of the jaguar produced no further effect than to move the body slightly, and this proved conclusively that there was no life left. It was safe to approach, which Tom and Ned did. Their first thought, after a glance at the jaguar, was for the Indian. It needed but a brief examination to show that he was not badly hurt. The jaguar had leaped on him from a low tree as he passed under it, as the boys learned afterward, and had crushed the man to earth by the weight of the spotted body more than by a stroke of the paw. The American jaguar is not so formidable a beast as the native name of tiger would cause one to suppose, though they are sufficiently dangerous, and this one had rather badly clawed the Indian. Fortunately the scratches were on the fleshy parts of the arms and shoulders, where, though painful, they were not necessarily serious. "But if you hadn't shot just when you did, Tom, it would have been all up with him," commented Ned. "Oh, well, I guess you'd have hit him if I hadn't," returned the young inventor. "But let's see what we can do for this chap." The man sat up wonderingly, hardly able to believe that he had been saved from the dreaded tigre. His wounds were bleeding rather freely, and as Tom and Ned carried with them a first aid kit, they now brought it into use. The wounds were bound up, the man was given water to drink, and then, as he was able to walk, Tom and Ned offered to help him wherever he wanted to go. "Blessed if I can tell whether he's one of our Indians or whether he belongs to the Beecher crowd," remarked Tom. "Senor Beecher," said the Indian, adding in Spanish that he lived in the vicinity and had only lately been engaged by the young professor, who hoped to discover the idol of gold before Tom's scientific friend could do so. Tom and Ned knew a little Spanish, and with that, and simple but expressive signs on the part of the Indian, they learned his story. He had his palm-thatched hut not far from the Beecher camp, in a small Indian village, and he, with others, had been hired on the arrival of the Beecher party to help with the excavations. These, for some reason, were delayed. "Delayed because they daren't use the map they stole from us," commented Ned. "Maybe," agreed Tom. The Indian, whose name, it developed, was Tal, as nearly as Tom and Ned could master it, had left camp to go to visit his wife and child in the jungle hut, intending to return to the Beecher camp at night. But as he passed through the forest the jaguar had dropped on him, bearing him to earth. "But you saved my life, Senor," he said to Tom, dropping on one knee and trying to kiss Tom's hand, which our hero avoided. "And now my life is yours," added the Indian. "Well, you'd better get home with it and take care of it," said Tom. "I'll have Professor Bumper come over and dress your scratches in a better and more careful way. The bandages we put on are only temporary." "My wife, she make a poultice of leaves. They cure me," said the Indian. "I guess that will be the best way," observed Ned. "These natives can doctor themselves for some things better than we can." "Well, we'll take him home," suggested Tom. "He might keel over from loss of blood. Come on," he added to Tal, indicating his object. It was not far to the natives' hut from the place where the jaguar had been killed, and there Tom and Ned underwent another demonstration of affection as soon as those of Tal's immediate family and the other natives understood what had happened. "I hate this business," complained Tom, after having been knelt to by the Indian's wife and child, who called him the "preserver," and other endearing titles of the same kind. "Come on, let's hike back." But Indian hospitality, especially after a life has been saved, is not so simple as all that. "My life, my house, all that I own is yours," said Tal in deep gratitude. "Take everything," and he waved his hand to indicate all the possessions in his humble hut. "Thanks," answered Tom, "but I guess you need all you have. That's a fine specimen of blowgun, though," he added, seeing one hanging on the wall. "I wouldn't mind having one like that. If you get well enough to make me one, Tal, and some arrows to go with it, I'd like it for a curiosity to hang in my room at home." "The Senor shall have a dozen," promised the Indian. "Look, Ned," went on Tom, pointing to the native weapon, "I never saw one just like this. They use small arrows or darts, tipped with wild cotton, instead of feathers." "These the arrows," explained Tal's wife, bringing a bundle from a corner of the one-room hut. As she held them out her husband gave a cry of fear. "Poisoned arrows! Poisoned arrows!" he exclaimed. "One scratch and the Senors are dead man. Put them away!" In fear the Indian wife prepared to obey, but as she did so Tom Swift caught sight of the package and uttered a strange cry. "Thundering hop toads, Ned!" he exclaimed. "The poisoned arrows are wrapped in the piece of oiled silk that was around the professor's missing map." End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of Tom Swift in the Land of Wonders. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tom Swift in the Land of Wonders by Victor Appleton. Chapter 20. An Old Legend. Fascinated, Tom and Ned gazed at the package the Indian woman held out to them. Undoubtedly it was oiled silk on the outside, and through the almost transparent covering could be seen the small arrows or darts used in the blowgun. "Where did you get that?" asked Tom, pointing to the bundle and gazing sternly at Tal. "What is the matter, Senor?" asked the Indian in turn. "Is it that you are afraid of the poisoned arrows? Be assured they will not harm you unless you are scratched by them." Tom and Ned found it difficult to comprehend all the rapid Spanish spoken by their host, but they managed to understand some, and his eloquent gestures made up the rest. "We're not afraid," Tom said, noting that the oiled skin well covered the dangerous darts. "But where did you get that?" "I picked it up after another Indian had thrown it away. He got it in your camp, Senor. I will not lie to you. I did not steal. Valdez went to your camp to steal. He is a bad Indian. And he brought back this wrapping. It contained something he thought was gold, but it was not so. So he—" "Quick! Yes, tell us!" demanded Tom eagerly. "What did he do with the professor's map that was in the oiled silk? Where is it?" "Oh, senors!" exclaimed the Indian woman, thinking perhaps her husband was about to be dealt harshly with when she heard Tom's excited voice. "Tal do no harm." "No, he did no harm," went on Tom, in a reassuring tone, "but he can do a whole lot of good if he tells us what became of the map that was in this oiled silk. Where is it?" he asked again. "Valdez burned it up," answered Tal. "What! Burned the professor's map?" cried Ned. "If that was in this yellow cloth, yes," answered the injured man. "Valdez he is bad. He say to me he is going to your camp to see what he can take. How he got this I know not, but he came back one morning with the yellow package. I see him, but he make me promise not to tell. But you save my life, I tell you everything." Valdez opened the package, but it is not gold, though he thinks so because it is yellow, and the man with no hair in his head keep it in his pocket close, so close, and Tal hugged himself to indicate what he meant. "That's Professor Bumper," explained Ned. "How did Valdez get the map out of the professor's coat?" asked Tom. "Valdez he very much smart. When man with no hair on his head take coat off for a minute to eat breakfast, Valdez take yellow thing out of pocket." "The Indian must have sneaked into camp when we were eating," said Tom. "Those from Beecher's party and our workers look all alike to us. We wouldn't know one from the other, and one of our rivals might slip in." "One evidently did, if this is really the piece of oiled silk that was around the professor's map," said Ned. "It certainly is the same," declared the young inventor. "See, there is his name," and he stretched out his hand to point. "Don't touch!" cried Tal. "Poisoned arrows, snake poison, very deadlike and quick." "Don't worry, I won't touch," said Tom grimly. "But go on. You say Valdez sneaked into our camp, took the oiled silk package from the coat pocket of Professor Bumper, and went back to his own camp with it, thinking it was gold." "Yes," answered Tal, though it is doubtful if he understood all that Tom said, as it was half Spanish and half English. But the Indian knew a little English too. "Valdez, when he find no gold, is very mad. Only papers in the yellow silk papers with queer marks on. Valdez think it may be a charm to work evil, so he burn them up, all up." "Burned that rare map!" gasped Tom. "All in fire," went on Tal, indicating by his hands the play of flames. "Valdez throw away yellow silk, and I take for my arrows so rain not wash off poison. I give to you if you like, with blowgun." "No, thank you," answered Tom, in disappointed tones. "The oiled silk is of no use without the map, and that's gone. Whew, but this is tough," he said to his chum. "As long as it was only stolen there was a chance to get it back, but if it's burned, the jig is up." "It looks so," agreed Ned. "We'd better get back and tell the professor. If he can't get along without the map, it's time he started a movement toward getting another. So it wasn't Beecher after all who got it." "Evidently not," assented Tom. "But I believe him capable of it." "You haven't much use for him," remarked Ned. "Huh!" was all the answer given by his chum. "I am sorry, senors," went on Tal, "but I could not stop Valdez and the burning of the papers." "No, you could not help it," interrupted the young inventor. "But it just happens that it brings bad luck to us. You see, Tal, the papers in this yellow covering told of an old buried city that the bald-headed professor, the man with no hair in his head, is very anxious to discover. It is somewhere under the ground," and he waved to the jungle all about them, pointing earthwards. "Paper Valdez burned tell of lost city?" asked Tal, his face lighting up. "Yes, but now, of course, we can't tell where to dig for it." The Indian turned to his wife, and talked rapidly with her in their own dialect. She, too, seemed greatly excited, making quick gestures. Finally she ran out of the hut. "Where is she going?" asked Tom suspiciously. "To get her grandfather. He very old Indian. He know story of buried cities under trees. Very old story. What you call legend maybe. But Goose'll know. He tell same as his grandfather told him. You wait. Goose'll come, and you listen." "Good, Ned!" suddenly cried Tom. "Maybe we'll get on the track of lost Curzon after all, through some ancient Indian legend. Maybe we won't need the map." "It hardly seems possible," said Ned slowly. "What can these Indians know of buried cities that were out of existence before Columbus came here? Why, they haven't any written history." "No, and that may be just the reason they are more likely to be right," returned Tom. "Legends handed down from one grandfather to another go back a good many hundred years. If they were written they might be destroyed as the professor's map was. Somehow or other, though I can't tell why, I begin to see daylight ahead of us." "I wish I did," remarked Ned. "Here comes Goosal, I think," murmured Tom, and he pointed to an Indian, bent with the weight of years, who, led by Tal's wife, was slowly approaching the hut. End of chapter 20. of Tom Swift and the Land of Wonders. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tom Swift and the Land of Wonders by Victor Appleton. Chapter 21. The Cavern. "Now, Goosal can tell you," said Tal, evidently pleased that he had, in a measure, solved the problem caused by the burning of the professor's map. "Goosal very old Indian. He know old stories, legends, very old." "Well, if he can tell us how to find the buried city of Kurzon and the things in it," said Tom, "he's all right." The aged Indian proceeded slowly toward the hut where the impatient youths awaited him. "I know what you seek in the buried city," remarked Tal. "Do you?" cried Tom, wondering if some one had indiscreetly spoken of the idol of gold. "Yes, you want pieces of rock, with strange writings on them. Old weapons, broken pots. I know. I have helped white men before." "Yes, those are the things we want," agreed Tom, with a glance at his chum. "That is, some of them. But does your wife's grandfather talk our language?" "No, but I can tell you what he says." By this time the old man, led by Mrs. Tal, as the young men called the wife of the Indian they had helped, entered the hut. He seemed nervous and shy, and glanced from Tom and Ned to his grandson-in-law, as the latter talked rapidly in the Indian dialect. Then Goosal made answer, but what it was all about the boys could not tell. "Goosal say," translated Tal, "that he know a story of a very old city away down underground." "Tell us about it," urged Tom eagerly. But a difficulty very soon developed. Tal's intentions were good, but he was not equal to the task of translating. Nor was the understanding of Tom and Ned of Spanish quite up to the mark. "Say, this is too much for me!" exclaimed Tom. "We are losing the most valuable part of this by not understanding what Goosal says and what Tal translates." "What can we do?" asked Ned. "Get the professor here as soon as possible. He can manage this dialect, and he'll get the information at first hand. If Goosal can tell where to begin excavating for the city, he ought to tell the professor, not us." "That's right," agreed Ned. "We'll bring the professor here as soon as we can." Accordingly, they stopped the somewhat difficult task of listening to the translated story and told Tal, as well as they could, that they would bring the "man with no hair on his head" to listen to the tale. This seemed to suit the Indians, all of whom in the small colony appeared to be very grateful to Tom and Ned for having saved the life of Tal. "That was a good shot you made when you bowled over the jaguar," said Ned, as the two young explorers started back to their camp. "Better than I realized, if it leads to the discovery of Kurzon and the idol of gold," remarked Tom. "And to think we should come across the oiled silk holding the poisoned arrows," went on Ned. "That's the strangest part of the whole affair. If it hadn't been that you shot the jaguar, this never would have come about." That Professor Bumper was astonished, and Mr. Damon likewise, when they heard the story of Tom and Ned, is stating it mildly. "Come on!" exclaimed the scientist, as Tom finished. "We must see this Goosal at once. If my map is destroyed, and it seems to be, this old Indian may be our only hope. Where did he say the buried city was, Tom?" "Oh, somewhere in this vicinity, as nearly as I could make out. But you'd better talk with him yourself. We didn't say anything about the idol of gold." "That's right. It's just as well to let the natives think we are only after ordinary relics." "Bless my insurance policy!" gasped Mr. Damon. "It does not seem possible that we are on the right track." "Well, I think we are, from what little information Goosal gave us," remarked Tom. "This buried city of his must be a wonderful place." "It is, if it is what I take it to be," agreed the professor. "I told you I would bring you to a land of wonders, Tom Swift, and they have hardly begun yet. Come, I am anxious to talk to Goosal." In order that the Indians in the Bumper camp might not hear rumors of the new plan to locate the hidden city, and at the same time to keep rumors from spreading to the camp of the rivals, the scientist and his friends started a new shaft and put a shift of men at work on it. "We'll pretend we are on the right track, and very busy," said Tom. "That will fool Beecher." "Are you glad to know he did not take your map, Professor Bumper?" asked Mr. Damon. "Well, yes. It is hard to believe such things of a fellow scientist." "If he didn't take it, he wanted to," said Tom. "And he has done, or will do, things as unsportsmanlike." "Oh, you are hardly fair, perhaps, Tom," commented Ned. Was all the answer he received. With the Indians in camp busy on the excavation work, and having ascertained that similar work was going on in the Beecher outfit, Professor Bumper, with Mr. Damon and the young man, set off to visit the Indian village and listen to Goosal's story. They passed the place where Tom had slain the jaguar, but nothing was left but the bones, the ants, vultures and jungle animals having picked them clean in the night. On the arrival of Tom and his friends at the Indian's hut, Goosal told, in language which Professor Bumper could understand, the ancient legend of the buried city as he had it from his grandfather. "But is that all you know about it, Goosal?" asked the savant. "No, learned one. It is true most of what I have told you was told to me by my father and his father's father, but I myself, with these eyes, have looked upon the lost city." "You have?" cried the professor, this time in English. "Where? When? Take us to it. How do you get there?" "Through the cavern of the dead," was the answer when the questions were modified. "Bless my diamond ring!" exclaimed Mr. Damon, when Professor Bumper translated the reply. "What does he mean?" And then, after some talk, this information came out. Years before, when Goosal was a young man, he had been taken by his grandfather on a journey through the jungle. They stopped one day at the foot of a high mountain, and, clearing away the brush and stones at a certain place, an entrance to a great cavern was revealed. This, it appeared, was the Indian burial ground, and had been used for generations. Goosal, though in fear and trembling, was led through it, and came to another cavern, vaster than the first. And there he saw strange and wonderful sights, for it was the remains of a buried city that had once been the home of a great and powerful tribe, unlike the Indians, the ancient Mayas, it would seem. "Can you take us to this cavern?" asked the professor. "Yes," answered Goosal. "I will lead to it those who saved the life of Tal, them and their friends. I will take you to the lost city." "Good!" cried Mr. Damon, when this had been translated. "Now let Beecher try to play any more tricks on us. Ho! For the cavern and the lost city of Curzon." "And the idol of gold," said Tom Swift to himself. "I hope we can get it ahead of Beecher. Perhaps if I can help in that Oh well, here's hoping, that's all," and a little smile curved his lips. Greatly excited by the strange news, but maintaining as calm an air outwardly as possible, so as not to excite the Indians, Tom and his friends returned to camp to prepare for their trip. Goosal had said the cavern lay distant more than a 2 days' journey into the jungle. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Tom Swift in the Land of Wonders. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tom Swift in the Land of Wonders by Victor Appleton. Chapter 22. The Storm. "Now," remarked Tom, once they were back again in their camp, "we must go about this trip to the cavern in a way that will cause no suspicion over there as to what our object is," and he nodded in the direction of the quarters of his rival. "Do you mean to go off quietly?" asked Ned. "Yes, and to keep the work going on here at these shafts," put in the scientist, "so that if any of their spies happen to come here they will think we still believe the buried city to be just below us. To that end we must keep the Indians digging, though I am convinced now that it is useless." Accordingly, preparations were made for an expedition into the jungle under the leadership of Goosal. Tal had not sufficiently recovered from the jaguar wounds to go with the party, but the old man, in spite of his years, was hale and hearty and capable of withstanding hardships. One of the most intelligent of the Indians was put in charge of the digging gangs as foreman, and told to keep them at work, and not to let them stray. Tolpec, whose brother Tom had tried to save, proved a treasure. He agreed to remain behind and look after the interests of his friends, and see that none of their baggage or stores were taken. "Well, I guess we're as ready as we ever shall be," remarked Tom, as the cavalcade made ready to start. Mules carried the supplies that were to be taken into the jungle, and others of the sturdy animals were to be ridden by the travelers. The trail was not an easy one, Goosal warned them. Tom and his friends found it even worse than they had expected, for all their experience in jungle and mountain traveling. In places it was necessary to dismount and lead the mules along, sometimes pushing and dragging them. More than once the trail fairly hung on the edge of some almost bottomless gorge, and again it wound its way between great walls of rock, so poised that they appeared about to topple over and crush the travelers. But they kept on with dogged patience through many hardships. To add to their troubles, they seemed to have entered the abode of the fiercest mosquitoes encountered since coming to Honduras. At times it was necessary to ride along with hats covered with mosquito netting, and hands encased in gloves. They had taken plenty of condensed food with them, and they did not suffer in this respect. Game, too, was plentiful, and the electric rifles of Tom and Ned added to the larder. One night, after a somewhat sound sleep induced by hard travel on the trail that day, Tom awoke to hear someone or something moving about among their goods, which included their provisions. "Who's there?" asked the young inventor sharply, as he reached for his electric rifle. There was no answer, but a rattling of the pans. "Speak, or I'll fire!" Tom warned, adding this in such Spanish as he could muster, for he thought it might be one of the Indians. No reply came, and then, seeing by the light of the stars a dark form moving in front of the tent occupied by himself and Ned, Tom fired. There was a combined grunt and squeal of pain, then a savage growl, and Ned yelled, "What's the matter, Tom?" for he had been awakened and heard the crackle of the electrical discharge. "I don't know," Tom answered, "but I shot something, or somebody." "Maybe some of Beecher's crowd," ventured his chum. But when they got their electric torches and focused them on the inert black object, it was found to be a bear which had come to nose about the camp for dainty morsels. Bruin was quite dead, and as he was in prime condition there was a feast of bear meat at the following dinner. The white travelers found it rather too strong for their palates, but the Indians reveled in it. It was shortly after noon the next day when Goosal, after remarking that a storm seemed brewing, announced that they would be at the entrance to the cavern in another hour. "Good!" cried Professor Bumper. "At last we are near the buried city." "Don't be too sure," advised Mr. Damon. "We may be disappointed, though I hope not, for your sake, my dear Professor." Goosal now took the lead, and the old Indian, traveling on foot, for he said he could better look for the old landmark that way than on the back of a mule, walked slowly along a rough cliff. "Here, somewhere, is the entrance to the cavern," said the aged man. "It was many years ago that I was here, many years, but it seems as though yesterday. It is little changed." Indeed, little did change in that land of wonders. Only nature caused what alterations there were. The hand of man had long been absent. Slowly Goosal walked along the rocky trail. On one side a sheer rock, towering 100 feet or more toward the sky. On the other side a deep gash leading to a great fertile valley below. Suddenly the old man paused, and looked about him as though uncertain. Then, more slowly still, he put out his hand and pulled at some bushes that grew on a ledge of the rock. They came away, having no depth of earth, and a small opening was disclosed. "It is here," said Goosal quietly. "The entrance to the cavern that leads to the burial place of the dead, and the city that is dead also. It is here." He stood aside while the others hurried forward. It took but a few minutes to prove that he was right, at least as to the existence of the cavern, for the four men were soon peering into the opening. "Come on!" cried Tom impetuously. "Wait a moment," suggested the professor. "Sometimes the air in these places is foul. We must test it." But a torch one of the Indians threw in burned with a steady glow. That test was conclusive, at least. They made ready to enter. Torches of a light bark, that glowed with a steady flame and little smoke, had been provided, as well as a good supply of electric dry battery lamps, and the way into the cavern was thus well lighted. At first the Indians were afraid to enter, but a word or two from Goosal reassured them, and they followed Professor Bumper, Tom, and the others into the cavern. For several hundred feet there was nothing remarkable about the cave. It was like any other cavern of the mountains, though wonderful for the number of crystal formations on the roof and walls, formations that sparkled like a million diamonds in the flickering lights. "Talk about a wonderland!" cried Tom. "This is fairyland!" A moment later, as Goosal walked on beside the professor and Tom, the aged Indian came to a pause, and, pointing ahead, murmured, "The city of the dead." They saw the niches cut in the rock walls, niches that held the countless bones of those who had died many, many years before. It was a vast Indian grave. "Doubtless a wealth of material of historic interest here," said Professor Bumper, flashing his torch on the skeletons. "But it will keep. Where is the city you spoke of, Goosal?" "Farther on, Senor. Follow me." Past the stone graves they went, deeper and deeper into the great cave. Their footsteps echoed and re-echoed. Suddenly Tom, who with Ned had gone a little ahead, came to a sudden halt and said, "Well, this may be a burial place sure enough, but I think I see something alive all right, if it isn't a ghost." He pointed ahead. Surely those were lights flickering and moving about, and yes, there were men carrying them. The Bumper party came to a surprised halt. The other lights advanced, and then, to the great astonishment of Professor Bumper and his friends, there confronted them in the cave several scientists of Professor Beecher's party and a score or more of Indians. Professor Hylop, who was known to Professor Bumper, stepped forward and asked sharply, "What are you doing here?" "I might ask you the same thing," was the retort. "You might, but you would not be answered," came sharply. "We have a right here, having discovered this cavern, and we claim it under a concession of the Honduras government. I shall have to ask you to withdraw." "Do you mean leave here?" asked Mr. Damon. "That is it exactly. We first discovered this cave. We have been conducting explorations in it for several days, and we wish no outsiders." "Are you speaking for Professor Beecher?" asked Tom. "I am. But he is here in the cave, and will speak for himself if you desire it. But I represent him, and I order you to leave. If you do not go peaceably, we will use force. We have plenty of it." And he glanced back at the Indians grouped behind him, scowling, savage Indians. "We have no wish to intrude," observed Professor Bumper, "and I fully recognize the right of prior discovery. But one member of our party, he did not say which one, was in this cave many years ago. He led us to it." "Ours is a government concession," exclaimed Professor Hylop harshly. "We want no intruders. Go!" And he pointed toward the direction whence Tom's party had come. "Drive them out!" he ordered the Indians in Spanish, and with muttered threats the dark-skinned men advanced towards Tom and the others. "You need not use force," said Professor Bumper. He and Professor Hylop had quarreled bitterly years before on some scientific matter, and the matter was afterward found to be wrong. Perhaps this made him vindictive. Tom stepped forward and started to protest, but Professor Bumper interposed. "I guess there is no help for it but to go. It seems to be theirs by right of discovery and government concession," he said, in disappointed tone. "Come, friends!" And dejectedly they retraced their steps. Followed by the threatening Indians, the Bumper party made its way back to the entrance. They had hoped for great things, but if the cavern gave access to the buried city, the ancient city of Curzon, on the chief altar of which stood the golden idol, Quetzal, it looked as though they were never to enter it. "We'll have to get our Indians and drive those fellows out," declared Tom. "I'm not going to be beaten this way, and by Beecher." "It is galling," declared Professor Bumper. "Still, he has right on his side, and I must give in to priority, as I would expect him to do. It is the unwritten law." "Then we've failed!" cried Tom bitterly. "Not yet," said Professor Bumper. "If I can not unearth that buried city, I may find another in this wonderland. I shall not give up." "Hark! What's that noise?" asked Tom, as they approached the entrance to the cave. "Sounds like a great wind blowing," commented Ned. It was. As they stood in the entrance they looked out to find a fierce storm raging. The wind was sweeping down the rocky trail, the rain was falling in veritable bucketfuls from the overhanging cliff, and deafening thunder and blinding lightning roared and flashed. "Surely you would not drive us out in this storm," said Professor Bumper to his former rival. "You cannot stay in the cave. You must get out," was the answer, as a louder crash of thunder than usual seemed to shake the very mountain. End of chapter 22. Swift in the Land of Wonders. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tom Swift in the Land of Wonders by Victor Appleton. Chapter 23. Entombed Alive. For an instant Tom and his friends paused at the entrance to the wonderful cavern, and looked at the raging storm. It seemed madness to venture out into it, yet they had been driven from the cave by those who had every right of discovery to say who, and who should not, partake of its hospitality. "We can't go out into that blow," cried Ned. "It's enough to loosen the very mountains." "Let's stay here and defy them," murmured Tom. "And if what we seek is here, we have as good a right to it as they have." "We must go out," said Professor Bumper simply. "I recognize the right of my rival to dispossess us." "He may have the right, but it isn't human," said Mr. Damon. "Bless my overshoes! If Beecher himself were here he wouldn't have the heart to send us out in this storm." "I would not give him the satisfaction of appealing to him," remarked Professor Bumper. "Come, we will go out. We have our ponchos, and we are not fair weather explorers. If we can't get to the lost city one way, we will another. Come, my friends." And despite the downpour, the deafening thunder, and the lightning that seemed ready to sear one's eyes, he walked out of the cave entrance, followed by Tom and the others. "Come on!" cried Tom, in a voice he tried to render confident, as they went out into the terrible storm. "We'll beat 'em yet!" The rain fell harder than ever. Small torrents were now rushing down the trail, and it was only a question of a few minutes before the place where they stood would be a raging river, so quickly does the rain collect in the mountains and speed toward the valleys. "We must take to the forest!" cried Tom. "There'll be some shelter there, and I don't like the way the geography of this place is behaving. There may be a landslide at any moment." As he spoke he motioned upward through the mist of the rain to the sloping side of the mountain towering above them. Loose stones were beginning to roll down, accompanied by patches of earth loosened by the water. Some of the patches carried with them bunches of grass and small bushes. "Yes, it will be best to move into the jungle," said the professor. "Goosal, you'd better take the lead." It was wonderful to see how well the aged Indian bore up in spite of his years, and walked on ahead. They had left their mules tethered some distance back, in a sheltering clump of trees, and they hoped the animals would be safe. The guide found a place where they could leave the trail, though going down a dangerous slope, and take to the forest. As carefully as possible they descended this, the rain continuing to fall, the wind to blow, the lightning to sizzle all about them, and the thunder to boom in their ears. They went on until they were beneath the shelter of the thick jungle growth of trees, which kept off some of the pelting drops. "This is better!" exclaimed Ned, shaking his poncho and getting rid of some of the water that had settled on it. "Bless my overcoat!" cried Mr. Damon. "We seem to have gotten out of the frying pan into the fire." "How?" asked Tom. "We are partly sheltered here, though had we stayed in the cave, in spite of—" A deafening crash interrupted him, and following the flash one of the giant trees of the forest was seen to blaze up and then topple over. "Struck by lightning!" yelled Ned. "Yes, and it may happen to us!" exclaimed Mr. Damon. "We were safer from the lightning in the open. Maybe—" Again came an interruption, but this time a different one. The very ground beneath their feet seemed to be shaking and trembling. "What is it?" gasped Ned, while Goosal fell on his knees and began fervently to pray. "It's an earthquake!" yelled Tom Swift. As he spoke there came another sound, the sound of a mass of earth in motion. It came from the direction of the mountain trail they had just left. They looked toward it, and their horror-stricken eyes saw the whole side of the mountain sliding down. Slowly at first the earth slid down, but constantly gathering force and speed. In the face of this new disaster the rain seemed to have ceased and the thunder and lightning to be less severe. It was as though one force of nature gave way to the other. "Look! Look!" gasped Ned. In silence, which was broken now only by a low and ominous rumble, more menacing than had been the awful fury of the elements, the travelers looked. Suddenly there was a quicker movement of seemingly one whole section of the mountain. Great rocks and trees, carried down by the appalling force of the landslide, were slipping over the trail, obliterating it as though it had never existed. "There goes the entrance to the cavern!" cried Ned, and as the others looked to where he pointed, they saw the hole in the side of the mountain, the mouth of the cave that led to the lost city of Kurzon, completely covered by thousands of tons of earth and stones. "That's the end of them!" exclaimed Tom, as the rumble of the earthquake died away. "Of—" Ned stopped, his eyes staring. "Of Professor Beecher's party. They're entombed alive." End of chapter 23. Of Tom Swift in the Land of Wonders. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tom Swift in the Land of Wonders by Victor Appleton. Chapter 24. The Revolving Stone. Stunned, not alone by the realization of the awfulness of the fate of their rivals, but also by the terrific storm and the effect of the earthquake and the landslide, Tom and his friends remained for a moment gazing toward the mouth of the cavern, now completely out of sight, buried by a mass of broken trees, tangled bushes, rocks, and earth. Somewhere, far beyond that mass, was the Beecher party, held prisoners in the cave that formed the entrance to the buried city. Tom was the first to come to a realization of what was needed to be done. "We must help them!" he exclaimed, and it was characteristic of him that he harbored no enmity. "How?" asked Ned. "We must get a force of Indians and dig them out," was the prompt answer. At Tom's vigorous words Professor Bumper's forces were energized into action, and he stated, "Fortunately we have plenty of excavating tools. We may be in time to save them. Come on!" The storm seems to have passed as suddenly as it came up, and the earthquake, which, after all, did not cover a wide area, seems to be over. We must start the work of rescue at once. We must go back to camp and get all the help we can muster." The storm, indeed, seemed to be over, but it was no easy matter to get back over the soggy, rain-soaked ground to the trail they had left to take shelter in the forest. Fortunately, the earthquake had not involved that portion where they had left their mules, but most of the frightened animals had broken loose, and it was some little time before they could all be caught. "It is no use to try to get back to camp tonight," said Tom, when the last of the pack and saddle animals had been corralled. "It is getting late, and there is no telling the condition of the trail. We must stay here until morning." "But what about them?" and Mr. Damon nodded in the direction of the entombed ones. "We can help them best by waiting until the beginning of a new day," said the professor. "We shall need a large force, and we could not bring it up tonight. Besides, Tom is right, and if we tried to go along the trail after dark, torn and disturbed as it is bound to be by the rain, we might get into difficulties ourselves. No, we must camp here until morning and then go for help." They all decided finally this was best. The professor, too, pointed out that their rivals were in a large and roomy cave, not likely to suffer from lack of air nor food or water, since they must have supplies with them. "The only danger is that the cave has been crushed in," added Tom. "But in that event we would be of no service to them anyhow." The night seemed very long, and it was a most uncomfortable one, because of the shock and exertions through which the party had passed. Added to this was the physical discomfort caused by the storm. But in time there was the light in the east that meant morning was at hand, and with it came action. A hasty breakfast, cups of steaming coffee forming a most welcome part, put them all in better condition, and once more they were on their way, heading back to the main camp where they had left their force of Indians. "My!" exclaimed Tom, as they made their way slowly along. "It surely was some storm. Look at those big trees uprooted over there. They're almost as big as the giant redwoods of California, and yet they were bowled over as if they were ten-pins." "I wonder if the wind did it, or the earthquake?" ventured Mr. Damon. "No wind could do that," declared Ned. "It must have been the landslide caused by the earthquake." "The wind could do it if the ground was made soft by the rain, and that was probably what did it," suggested Tom. "There's no harm in settling the point," commented Professor Bumper. "It is not far off our trail, and will take only a few minutes to go over to the trees. I should like to get some photographs to accompany an article that perhaps I shall write on the effects of sudden and severe tropical storms. We'll go to look at the overturned trees, and then we'll hurry on to camp to get the rescue party." The uprooted trees lay on one side of the mountain trail, perhaps a mile from the mouth of the cave which had been covered over, entombing the Beecher party. Leaving the mules in charge of one of the Indians, Professor Bumper and his friends, accompanied by Goosal, approached the fallen trees. As they neared them, they saw that in falling the trees had lifted with their roots a large mass of earth and embedded rocks that had clung to the twisted and gnarled fibers. This mass was as large as a house. "Look at the hole they left when the roots pulled out!" cried Ned. "Why, it's like the crater of a small volcano," he added. And as they stood on the edge of it, looking curiously at the hole made, the others agreed with Tom's chum. Professor Bumper was looking about, trying to ascertain if there were any evidences of the earthquake in the vicinity, when Tom, who had cautiously gone a little way down into the excavation caused by the fallen trees, uttered a cry of surprise. "Look!" he shouted. "Isn't that some sort of tunnel or underground passage?" And he pointed to a square opening, perhaps 7 feet high and nearly as broad, which extended, no one knew where, downward and onward from the side of the hole made by the uprooting of the trees. "It's an underground passage, all right," said Professor Bumper eagerly, "and not a natural one either. That was fashioned by the hand of man, if I am any judge. It seems to go right under the mountain, too. Friends, we must explore this. It may be of the utmost importance. Come, we have our electric torches, and we shall need them, for it's very dark in there." And he peered into the passage in front of which they all stood now. It seemed to have been tunneled through the earth, the sides being lined by either slabs of stone or walls made by a sort of concrete. "But what about the rescue work?" asked Mr. Damon. "I am not forgetting Professor Beecher and his friends," answered the scientist. "Perhaps this may be a better means of rescuing them than by digging them out, which will take a week at least," observed Tom. "This a better way?" asked Ned, pointing to the tunnel. "That's it," confirmed the savant. "If you will notice, it extends back in the direction of the cave from which we were driven. Now, if there is a buried city beneath all this jungle, this mountain of earth and stones, the accumulation of centuries, it is probably on the bottom of some vast cavern. It is my opinion that we are only in one end of that cavern, and this may be the entrance to another end of it." "Then," asked Mr. Damon, "do you mean that we can enter here, get into the cave that contains the buried city, or part of it, and find there Beecher and his friends?" "That's it." "It is possible, and if we could it would save an immense lot of work, and probably be a surer way to save their lives than by digging a tunnel through the landslide to find the mouth of the cave where we first entered." "It's a chance worth taking," said Mr. Damon. "Of course it is a chance. But then everything connected with this expedition is, so one is no worse than another. As you say, we may find the entombed men more easily this way than any other." "I wonder," said Tom slowly, "if by any chance we shall find, through this passage, the lost city we are looking for." "And the idol of gold," added Ned. "Goosal, do you know anything about this?" asked Professor Bumper. "Did you ever hear of another passage leading to the cave where you saw the ancient city?" "No, learned one, though I have heard stories about there being many cities, or parts of a big one, beneath the mountain, and when it was above ground there were many entrances to it." "That settles it!" cried the professor in English, having talked to Goosal in Spanish. "We'll try this, and see where it leads." They entered the stone-lined passage. In spite of the fact that it had probably been buried and concealed from light and air for centuries, as evidenced by the growth of the giant trees above it, the air was fresh. "And this is one reason," said Tom, in commenting on this fact, "why I believe it leads to some vast cavern which is connected in some fashion with the outer air. Well, perhaps we shall soon make a discovery." Eagerly and anxiously the little party pressed forward by the light of the pocket electric lamps. They were obsessed by two thoughts: what they might find, and the necessity for aiding in the rescue of their rivals. On and on they went, the darkness illuminated only by the torches they carried. but they noticed that the air was still fresh, and that a gentle wind blew toward them. The passage was undoubtedly artificial, a tunnel made by the hands of men now long crumbled into dust. It had a slightly upward slope, and this, Professor Bumper said, indicated that it was bored upward and perhaps into the very heart of the mountain, somewhere in the interior of which was the Beecher party. Just how far they went they did not know, but it must have been more than 2 miles. Yet they did not tire, for the way was smooth. Suddenly Tom, who with Professor Bumper was in the lead, uttered a cry, as he held his torch above his head and flashed it about in a circle. "We're blocked!" he exclaimed. "We're up against a stone wall!" It was but too true. Confronting them, and extending from side to side across the passage and from roof to floor, was a great rough stone. Immense and solid it seemed when they pushed on it in vain. "Nothing short of dynamite will move that," said Ned in despair. "This is a blind lead. We'll have to go back." "But there must be something on the other side of that stone," cried Tom. "See, it is pierced with holes, and through them comes a current of air. If we could only move the stone." "I believe it is an ancient door," remarked Professor Bumper. Eagerly and frantically they tried to move it by their combined weight. The stone did not give the fraction of the breadth of a hair. "We'll have to go back and get some of your big tunnel blasting powder, Tom," suggested Ned. As he spoke, old Goosal glided forward. He had remained behind them in the passage while they were trying to move the rock. Now he said something in Spanish. "What does he mean?" asked Ned. "He asks that he be allowed to try," translated Professor Bumper. "Sometimes, he says, there is a secret way of opening stone doors in these underground caves. Let him try." Goosal seemed to be running his fingers lightly over the outer edge of the door. He was muttering to himself in his Indian tongue. Suddenly he uttered an exclamation, and, as he did so, there was a noise from the door itself. It was a grinding, scraping sound, a rumble as though rocks were being rolled one against the other. Then the astonished eyes of the adventurers saw the great stone door revolve on its axis and swing to one side, leaving a passage open through which they could pass. Goosal had discovered the hidden mechanism. What lay before them? End of chapter 24. Of Tom Swift and the Land of Wonders. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tom Swift and the Land of Wonders by Victor Appleton. Chapter 25. The Idol of Gold. "Forward!" cried Tom Swift. "Where?" asked Mr. Damon, hanging back for an instant. "Bless my compass, Tom! Do you know where you're going?" "I haven't the least idea, but it must lead to something, or the ancients who made this revolving stone door wouldn't have taken such care to block the passage." "Ask Goosal if he knows anything about it," suggested Mr. Damon to the professor. "He says he never was here before," translated the savant. "But years ago, when he went into the hidden city by the cave we left yesterday, he saw doors like this which opened this way." "Then we're on the right track!" cried Tom. "If this is the same kind of door, it must lead to the same place. Ho for Kuzan and the idol of gold!" As they passed through the stone door, Tom and Professor Bumper tried to get some idea of the mechanism by which it worked. But they found this impossible, it being hidden within the stone itself or in the adjoining walls. But in order that it might not close of itself and entomb them, the portal was blocked open with stones found in the passage. "It's always well to have a line of retreat open," said Tom. "There's no telling what may lie beyond us." For a time there seemed to be nothing more than the same passage along which they had come. Then the passage suddenly widened, like the large end of a square funnel. Upward and outward the stone walls swept, and they saw dimly before them, in the light of their torches, a vast cavern, seemingly formed by the falling in of mountains, which, in toppling over, had met overhead in a sort of rough arch, thus protecting, in a great measure, that which lay beneath them. Goosal, who had brought with him some of the fiber bark torches, set a bundle of them aflame. As they flared up, a wondrous sight was revealed to Tom Swift and his friends. Stretching out before them, as though they stood at the end of an elevated street and gazed down on it, was a city. A large city, with streets, houses, open squares, temples, statues, fountains, dry for centuries, a buried and forgotten city, a city in ruins, a city of the dead, now dry as dust, but still a city, or rather, the strangely preserved remains of one. "Look!" whispered Tom. A louder voice just then would have seemed a sacrilege. "Look!" "Is it what we are looking for?" asked Ned in a low voice. "I believe it is," replied the professor. "It is the lost city of Kurzon, or one just like it. And now if we can find the idol of gold, our search will be ended, at least the major part of it." "Where did you expect to find the idol?" asked Tom. "It should be in the main temple. Come, we will walk in the ancient streets, streets where no feet but ours have trod in many centuries. Come." In eager silence they pressed on through this newly discovered wonderland. For it was a wonderful city, or had been. Though much of it was in ruins, probably caused by an earthquake or an eruption from a volcano, the central portion, covered as it was by the overtoppling mountains that formed the arching roof, was well preserved. There were rude but beautiful stone buildings. There were archways, temples, public squares, and images, not at all beautiful, for they seemed to be of man-monsters, doubtless ancient gods. There were smoothly paved streets, wondrously carved fountains, some in ruins, all now as dry as bone, but which must have been places of beauty where youths and maidens gathered in the ancient days. Of the ancient population there was not a trace left. Tom and his friends penetrated some of the houses, but not so much as a bone or a heap of moldering dust showed where the remains of the people were. Either they had fled at the approaching doom of the city and were buried elsewhere, or some strange fire or other force of nature had consumed and obliterated them. "What a wealth of historic information I shall find here!" murmured Professor Bumper, as he caught sight of the many inscriptions in strange characters on the walls and buildings. "I shall never get to the end of them." "But what about the idol of gold?" asked Mr. Damon. "Do you think you'll find that?" "We must hurry on to the temple over there," said the scientist, indicating a building further along. "And then we must see about rescuing your rivals, Professor," put in Tom. "Yes, Tom, but fortunately we are on the ground here before them," agreed the professor. Undoubtedly it was the chief temple, or place of worship, of the long-dead race which the explorers now entered. It was a building beautiful in its barbaric style, and yet simple. There were massive walls, and a great inner court, at the end of which seemed to be some sort of altar. And then, as they lighted fresh torches, and pressed forward with them and their electric lights, they saw that which caused a cry of satisfaction to burst from all of them. The idol of gold! Yes, there it squatted, an ugly, misshapen figure, a cross between a toad and a Gila monster, half man, half beast, with big red eyes, rubies probably, that gleamed in the repulsive golden face, and the whole figure, weighing many pounds, seemed to be of solid gold. Eagerly the others followed Professor Bumper up the altar steps to the very throne of the golden idol. The scientist touched it, tried to raise it and make sure of its solidity and material. "This is it!" he cried. "It is the idol of gold. We have found it, for it belongs to all of us." "Hooray!" cried Tom Swift, and Ned and Mr. Damon joined in the cry. There was no need for silence or caution now, and yet, as they stood about the squat and ugly figure, which, in spite of its hideousness, was worth a fortune intrinsically and as an antique, they heard from the direction of the stone passage a noise. "What is it?" asked Tom Swift. There was a murmur of voices. "Indians!" cried Professor Bumper, recognizing the language, a mixture of Spanish and Indian. The cave was illuminated by the glare of other torches which seemed to rush forward. A moment later it was seen that they were being carried by a number of Indians. "Friends," murmured Goosal, using the Spanish term amigos. "They are our own Indians!" cried Tom Swift. "I see Tolpec," and he pointed to the native who had deserted from Jacinto's force to help them. "How did they get here?" asked Professor Bumper. This was quickly told. In their camp, where, under the leadership of Tolpec, they had been left to do the excavating, the natives had heard, seen, and felt the effects of the storm and the earthquake, though it did little damage in their vicinity. But they became alarmed for the safety of the professor and his party, and, at Tolpec's suggestion, set off in search of them. The Indians had seen, passing along the trail, the uprooted trees, and had noted the footsteps of the explorers going down to the stone passage. It was easy for them to determine that Tom and his friends had gone in, since the marks of their boots were plainly in evidence in the soft soil. None of the Indians was as much wrought up over the discovery of Kurzon and the idol as were the white adventurers. The gold, of course, meant something to the natives, but they were indifferent to the wonders of the underground city. Perhaps they had heard too many legends concerning such things to be impressed. "That statue is yours, all yours," said old Goosal, when he had talked with his relatives and friends among the natives. "They all say what you find you keep, and we will help you keep it." "That's good," murmured Professor Bumper. "There was some doubt in my mind as to our right to this, but after all the natives who live in this land are the original owners, and if they pass title to us it is clear. That settles the last difficulty." "Except that of getting the idol out," said Mr. Damon. "Oh, we'll accomplish that!" cried Tom. "I can hardly believe my luck," declared Professor Bumper. "I shall write a whole book on this idol alone, and then—" Once more came an interruption. This time it was from another direction, but it was of the same character, an approaching band of torch-bearers. They were Indians too, but leading them were a number of whites. And at their head was no less personage than Professor Beecher himself. For a moment, as the three parties stood together in the ancient temple, in the glare of many torches, no one spoke. Then Professor Bumper found his voice. "We are glad to see you," he said to his rival. "That is, glad to see you alive, for we saw the landslide bury you, and we were coming to dig you out. We thought this cave, the cave of the buried city, would lead us to you easier than by digging through the slide. We have just discovered this idol," and he put his hand on the grim golden image. "Oh, you have discovered it, have you?" asked Professor Beecher, and his voice was bitter. "Yes, not 10 minutes ago. The natives have kindly acknowledged my right to it under the law of priority. I am sorry, but—" With a look of disgust and chagrined disappointment on his face, Professor Beecher turned to the other scientists and said, "Let us go. We are too late. He has what I came after." "Well, it is the fortune of war and discovery," put in Mr. Hardy, one of the party who seemed the least ill-natured. "Your luck might have been ours, Professor Bumper. I congratulate you." "Thank you. Are you sure your party is all right, not in need of assistance? How did you get out of the place you were buried?" "Thank you, we do not require any help. It was good of you to think of us. But we got out the way we came in. We did not enter the tunnel as you did, but came in through another entrance which was not closed by the landslide. Then we made a turn through a gateway in a tunnel connecting with ours, a gateway which seems to have been opened by the earthquake, and we came here just now." "Too late, I see, to claim the discovery of the idol of gold," went on Mr. Hardy. "But I trust you will be generous and allow us to make observations of the buildings and other relics." "As much as you please, and with the greatest pleasure in the world," was the prompt answer of Professor Bumper. "All I lay sole claim to is the golden idol. You are at liberty to take whatever else you find in Kurzon, and to make what observations you like." "That is generous of you, and quite in contrast to the conduct of our leader. I trust he may awaken to a sense of the injustice he did you." But Professor Beecher was not there to hear this. He had stalked away in anger. "Humph!" grunted Tom. Then he continued, "That story about a government concession was all a fake, Professor, else he'd have put up a fight now. Contemptible sneak!" In fact, the story of Tom Swift's trip to the underground land of wonders is ended. For with the discovery of the idol of gold, the main object of the expedition was accomplished. But their adventures were not over by any means, though there is not room in this volume to record them. Suffice it to say that means were at once taken to get the golden image out of the cave of the ancient city. It was not accomplished without hard work, for the gold was heavy, and Professor Bumper would not, naturally, consent to the shaving off of so much as an ear or part of the flat nose, to say nothing of one of the half-dozen extra arms and legs with which the ugly idol was furnished. Finally it was safely taken out of the cave, and along the stone passage to the opening formed by the overthrown trees, and thence on to camp. And at the camp a surprise awaited Tom. Some long-delayed mail had been forwarded from the nearest place of civilization, and there were letters for all, including several for our hero. One in particular he picked out first and read eagerly. "Well, is every little thing all right, Tom?" asked Ned, as he saw a cheerful grin spread itself over his chum's face. "I should say it is, and then some. Look here, Ned. This is a letter from—" "I know. Mary Nestor. Go on." "How'd you guess?" "Oh, I'm a mind reader." "Huh! Well, you know, she was away when I went to call to say good-bye, and I was a little afraid Beecher had got an inside edge on me." "Had he?" "No, but he tried hard enough. He went to see Mary in Fayetteville, just as you heard, before he came on to join this party, but he didn't pay much of a visit to her." "No?" "No. Mary told him he'd better hurry along to Central America, or wherever it was he intended going, as she didn't care for him as much as he flattered himself she did." "Good!" cried Ned. "Shake, old man. I'm glad." They shook hands. "Well, what's the matter? Didn't you read all of her letter?" asked Ned when he saw his chum once more perusing the epistle. "No. There's a postscript here. Sorry I couldn't see you before you left. It was a mistake. But when you come back—" "Oh, that part isn't any of your affair," and blushing under his tan, Tom thrust the letter into his pocket and strode away, while Ned laughed happily. With the idol of gold safe in their possession, Professor Bumper's party could devote their time to making other explorations in the buried city. This they did, as is testified to by a long list of books and magazine articles since turned out by the scientist, dealing strictly with the archaeological subjects, touching on the ancient Mayan race and its civilization, with particular reference to their system of computing time. Professor Beecher, young and foolish, would not consent to delve into the riches of the ancient city, being too much chagrined over the loss of the idol. It seems he had really promised to give a part of it to Mary Nestor, but he never got the chance. His colleagues, after their first disappointment at being beaten, joined forces with Professor Bumper in exploring the old city, and made many valuable discoveries. In one point Professor Bumper had done his rival an injustice. That was in thinking Professor Beecher was responsible for the treachery of Jacinto. That was due to the plotter's own work. It was true that Professor Beecher had tentatively engaged Jacinto, and had sent word to him to keep other explorers away from the vicinity of the ancient city if possible, but Jacinto, who did not return Professor Bumper's money, as he had promised, had acted treacherously in order to enrich himself. Professor Beecher had nothing to do with that, nor had he with the taking of the map, as has been seen, the loss of which, after all, was a blessing in disguise, for Curzon would never have been located by following the directions given there, as it was very inaccurate. In another point it was demonstrated that the old documents were at fault. This was in reference to the golden idol having been overthrown and another set up in its place, an act which had caused the destruction of Curzon. It is true that the city was destroyed, or rather buried, but this catastrophe was probably brought about by an earthquake. And another great idol, one of clay, was found, perhaps a rival of Quetzal, but it was this clay image which was thrown down and broken, and not the golden one. Perhaps an effort had been made, just before the burying of the city, to change idols and the system of worship, but Quetzal seemed to have held his own. The old manuscripts were not very reliable, it was found, except in general. "Well, I guess this will hold Beecher for a while," said Tom, the night of the arrival of Mary's letter, and after he had written one in answer, which was dispatched by a runner to the nearest place whence mail could be forwarded. "Yes, luck seems to favor you," replied Ned. "You've had a hand in the discovery of the idol of gold, and—" "Yes, and I discovered something else I wasn't quite sure of," interrupted Tom, as he felt to make sure he had a certain letter safe in his pocket. It was several weeks later that the explorations of Curzon came to an end, a temporary end, for the rainy season set in, when the tropics are unsuitable for white men. Tom, Professor Bumper, Ned, and Mr. Damon set forth for the United States, the valuable idol of gold safe on board. And there, with their vessel plowing the blue waters of the Caribbean Sea, we will take leave of Tom Swift and his friends. End of chapter 25. End of Tom Swift in the Land of Wonders.